Most people who change an entire industry don't announce it. They don't hold a press conference, they don't post a manifesto, and they definitely don't look like someone who belongs on a stage. Matt Wetzel looked like a guy who'd been working outside his whole life. Big beard, calloused hands, a junkyard in Hurricane, Utah, and a towing company most people outside the state had never heard of. He wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. He was just trying to stop losing money on jobs that took too long and cost too much. But the decision he made, to throw out the conventional playbook entirely and build something from scratch, didn't just fix his business, it changed how the entire off-road recovery world operates. The lightweight rigs, the kinetic rope system, the whole approach that thousands of operators now take for granted, that started with one stubborn tow truck driver who got tired of watching heavy irons sink into Utah sand, and somehow, in the middle of all that, he accidentally became one of the most watched people on the internet. This is how it happened, and why almost nobody was paying attention when it did. Matt Wetzel didn't grow up dreaming about tow trucks. For 12 years, his world was roofing. Long days, physical work, the kind of job that teaches you quickly how much punishment your body can take before it starts filing complaints. He spent the first 10 of those years working for someone else, learning the trade from the ground up. Then he went into business for himself. He and a partner co-founded Skyline Roofing in Hurricane, Utah, a legitimate operation that by all accounts was doing well. It's still running today. Matt just wasn't going to be part of it much longer. He sold his share of Skyline and made a pivot that raised more than a few eyebrows. In 2009, he bought the assets of a local towing company and launched Red Ryder Towing. No formal towing background, no industry connections, no real roadmap. What he had was 12 years of understanding how equipment works, how to solve problems on the fly, and how to manage a business that doesn't stop when you're tired. He stepped into towing, as he later put it, going full speed. 4 years in, he made another move. In 2013, he purchased an already established operation called Winder Towing, a company that had been part of the hurricane community since 1981. His reasoning was straightforward. Why spend years trying to build something when you can buy something that's already built? He kept the Winder name and folded his operation into it. That company would go on to become the engine behind everything, the YouTube channel, the merchandise line, the brand. It would also eventually land him in a courtroom. For roughly a decade, Matt ran Winder Towing the way most operators run their businesses. Standard rigs, conventional methods, the same approach the industry had been using for years. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady. Hurricane sits in Washington County, deep in southern Utah, surrounded by some of the most unforgiving terrain in the country. Red rock, loose sand, canyon trails that don't show up on most maps. Conventional towing handled the highway calls fine. But the moment a vehicle went off-road and got properly stuck, the limitations of the standard playbook became obvious fast. Matt was watching hours bleed away on jobs that should have taken 40 minutes. He was watching customers stranded in the heat while he figured out how to get a heavy rig somewhere a heavy rig was never meant to go. Something had to change, and Matt was already thinking about what that looked like. Southern Utah doesn't forgive bad equipment. The terrain out there operates by its own rules. Deep sand washes, steep canyon walls, trails that switch from packed dirt to loose shale without warning. People get stuck out there in ways that would make a standard tow truck operator turn around and drive home. Not because the job is impossible, but because the tools most operators show up with were never designed for that environment in the first place. Matt was showing up with those tools, and the jobs were eating him alive. A vehicle buried in Sand Hollow could take 3, 4, sometimes 5 hours to extract using conventional methods. Heavy recovery trucks would bog down before they even reached the stuck vehicle. Winch setups that worked fine on a paved shoulder became useless the moment there was no solid anchor point and 60 feet of loose sand between you and the problem. The clock kept running, the customer kept waiting, and Matt kept watching a straightforward recovery turn into an all-day ordeal that nobody was getting paid enough for. He didn't accept it as just the nature of the business. That's an important distinction. A lot of operators in his position would have shrugged, charged more per hour, and moved on. Matt started pulling the problem apart. If the trucks were too heavy, modify the trucks. If the rigging wasn't right, change the rigging. He started adapting his existing equipment, reinforcing, reconfiguring, putting rigs into situations their manufacturers never intended. He was essentially trying to force conventional towing hardware to do something it fundamentally wasn't built to do. It didn't work, not really. The modifications helped on the margins, but the core issue remained. The whole model was wrong. A conventional tow rig is built for roads, for weight, for leverage, for pulling in predictable conditions with predictable surfaces. Off-road recovery in serious terrain is almost the opposite of that. It requires agility over mass, flexibility over brute force, and an understanding of momentum and energy transfer that most towing textbooks don't cover. Matt arrived at a conclusion that felt obvious in hindsight but was genuinely uncomfortable to sit with at the time. The industry standard approach to off-road stuck vehicles wasn't just inefficient, it was the wrong solution to the problem entirely, not a flawed version of the right answer. The wrong answer, dressed up in heavy iron and billed by the hour. Starting over from scratch wasn't the safe move. It wasn't the practical move, but it was the only move that made any sense. And that's exactly what he did. Matt's friends introduced him to kinetic energy ropes, and that introduction changed the trajectory of his entire business. He said it himself, without that discovery, off-road recovery probably never would have become financially viable for him. That's not a throwaway line. That's a man who ran the numbers and understood exactly how close he came to never going down this road at all. A kinetic rope works differently than a tow strap or a chain. It stretches up to 30% of its length, storing energy as it loads, then releasing that stored force in a controlled snap that transfers momentum into the stuck vehicle, rather than just yanking against it. The difference in practice is enormous. Where a rigid pull tears at recovery points and risks snapping under sudden load, a kinetic rope builds pressure gradually and then delivers it in a wave. Vehicles that would take hours to drag out with conventional rigging were coming free in minutes, not slightly faster. Minutes where hours used to be, but the rope alone only solved half the problem. You still needed a vehicle that could actually reach the stuck vehicle, which meant the heavy iron had to go. Matt scrapped the conventional playbook entirely and started with a clean slate. He took a 2001 Jeep Cherokee, stripped it down, rebuilt it with recovery work in mind, and painted it bright yellow. It looked more like something you'd see at a county fair than a professional recovery rig. Customers weren't exactly rushing to feel confident about it. One of them made that very clear. A man whose Class C motorhome was buried deep in desert sand took one look at the little yellow Jeep pulling up to his situation and laughed. He called it the banana, not as a compliment. Matt didn't argue. He hooked up the kinetic rope, made the pull, and had that motorhome moving in minutes. The customer who had been laughing 30 seconds earlier became one of the channel's most referenced stories. The banana had made a believer out of a skeptic, and word started to travel. That Jeep became the proof of concept. Later, Matt built the Morvair, a heavily modified Chevrolet Corvair that looked even more out of place on a recovery job, applying the same core philosophy. Light, nimble, purpose-built, paired with the right rope and the right technique. Jobs that used to consume most of a workday were suddenly wrapped up before lunch. The approach wasn't just more efficient, it was a completely different way of thinking about the problem. And people were starting to notice. Word travels fast in a small community, and Hurricane, Utah is exactly that. When people started hearing that a guy with a yellow Jeep and a funny-looking rope was pulling out vehicles in a fraction of the time it used to take and charging less to do it, the calls started coming in differently. Not just from locals with stuck trucks, from people who had heard the story secondhand, from visitors who had gone off-road and gotten themselves into serious trouble, from corners of southern Utah where nobody else was willing to go. Matt wasn't just faster, he was accessible in a way that conventional operators couldn't match. The trails and washes that other towing companies would decline or quote 3 hours on were becoming routine jobs for winter towing. The lightweight rig and kinetic rope combination didn't just improve the work. It opened up an entirely new category of work that hadn't been reliably served before. That's a meaningful distinction. He wasn't taking business from competitors. He was doing jobs that previously had no good solution. The rope itself became its own conversation. Customers asked about it, other off-road enthusiasts asked about it, people who had watched a recovery wanted to know what that yellow stretchy line was and where they could get one. Matt recognized what was happening and eventually partnered with Yankum Ropes to develop his own signature line, a product built around the exact specifications and techniques he had refined through years of real-world recoveries. Not a licensing deal where his name goes on someone else's design. A genuine collaboration built on accumulated experience. The commercial side of that decision turned out to be significant. Matt's walk-in store, operating out of the junkyard in Hurricane, grew to the point where retail sales were generating more revenue than the towing company itself. The tool that had saved his recovery business became a revenue stream that dwarfed it. Kinetic ropes, recovery gear, merchandise. The brand that had started as a practical solution to a terrain problem was quietly becoming something much larger. None of this was planned. Matt has never come across as someone who mapped out a 5-year brand strategy. He found something that worked, went deep on it, and let the results speak. But there was one more decision still ahead of him, one that would take everything he had built in that junkyard and put it in front of millions of people who had never heard of Hurricane Utah. All it required was an iPhone and a willingness to let strangers watch him work. It didn't start as a business decision. It didn't start as a content strategy or a monetization plan or anything that resembles the way people typically talk about building a YouTube channel. It started because two guys with desk jobs wanted to live vicariously through their friend's more interesting workday. Matt had a couple of close friends, one an airline pilot, the other a nuclear engineer, who had been hearing his recovery stories for years. The kind of stories that sound unbelievable until you see the terrain and understand that southern Utah genuinely produces situations that defy logic on a weekly basis. They kept telling him he should be documenting it, write a book, send pictures, do something with this. Matt started sending audio recaps and photos after jobs. His friends loved it, they wanted more. So he started filming. Nothing elaborate, an iPhone, whatever angle he could manage while also running the recovery. No editing background, no camera training, no real plan beyond capturing what was already happening in front of him. The footage was raw, the production was basic, and none of that turned out to matter at all. On March 28, 2019, Matt launched the Matt's Off-Road Recovery YouTube channel. He was in his mid-40s, self-described as technology impaired, running a towing company in a town most of the country couldn't place on a map. The odds of it going anywhere were not obviously good. The audience disagreed. Viewers responded to exactly what Matt was: unscripted, unpretentious, genuinely skilled at something most people had never seen documented before. Every recovery was different. The terrain changed, the vehicles changed, the circumstances changed. There was real suspense in watching a kinetic rope load up against a buried truck, real satisfaction when it came free, and real entertainment in the rotating cast of characters that began forming around the operation. Jamie, Matt's wife, his sons, Ed, the elderly mechanic who had essentially come with the property when Matt bought it. The crew felt like a family because it largely was one. Within 3.5 years, the channel had accumulated nearly 1.5 million subscribers and was closing in on 630 million total views. It would eventually grow past 1.9 million subscribers. AdSense revenue alone was estimated at around $47,000 per month. The walk-in store at the junkyard was already outselling the towing company. A business built on a yellow Jeep and a stretchy rope had become a media operation. Matt was still filming on location, still showing up to recoveries, still the same guy. The scale around him had just changed completely. By late 2021, Matt's Off-Road Recovery was pulling in nearly 1 million subscribers, and the channel was growing faster than anyone had anticipated. The brand was built on a specific kind of trust. A guy who showed up where nobody else would, got the job done, and charged a fair price doing it. That reputation was the whole foundation, which made what happened in December of that year hit considerably harder than it might have for someone else. Utah's insurance fraud division charged Matt with 1 count of second-degree felony insurance fraud. The charge alleged that Winder Towing had submitted over $15,000 in claims to AAA containing material misrepresentations, meaning the paperwork described jobs that weren't what actually happened. The alleged conduct spanned from January 2019 through August 2020, and the details laid out in the charging documents were specific enough that they were difficult to dismiss. 3 separate situations were cited. In one, a Polaris RZR recovery, the kind AAA doesn't cover, was reportedly claimed as a standard truck tow, with the RZR owner using a friend's membership to cover it. In another, a customer without an AAA membership was allegedly told by Matt to sign up, wait a few days, then file a claim for a job that had already been completed. A third involved construction materials that Matt had delivered being billed through AAA as vehicle tows. The individual who submitted those claims later told investigators the vehicles were never actually towed. Matt didn't deny that the paperwork was wrong. In a phone call with investigators, he said the claims were, and this is his own phrasing, wrong on the front end but fair on the back. His position was that every claim had a legitimate service behind it, that he had genuinely helped these people, and that the billing arrangements were informal solutions to customers who couldn't pay up front. Whether that explanation satisfied the legal standard was a separate question entirely. A second-degree felony in Utah carries up to 15 years in prison. That's the number that circulated through the off-road community when the story broke, and it rattled people. On February 27, 2022, Matt entered a no-contest plea to a reduced Class A misdemeanor charge. 5th District Judge Jeffrey Wilcox sentenced him to 18 months of probation and ordered him to pay $15,328 back to AAA and an additional $1,745 to Utah's Insurance Fraud Division. The channel kept uploading, the subscribers kept coming, but the comment sections were never quite the same after that. One of the things that made Matt's off-road recovery work as a YouTube channel, beyond the recoveries themselves, was the cast. Viewers didn't just tune in for stuck vehicles. They tuned in for the people pulling them out. And over time, one by one, a lot of those people moved on. Not in dramatic fashion, not with public fallouts or bitter exit interviews, just quietly the way people leave most jobs when something else calls louder. Randy was one of the first to go. He had been with the channel almost from the beginning, a camera operator known for his laugh as much as his work, a father of 8 with an easy personality that translated well on screen. In March of 2021, he stepped away and launched his own channel, All Terrain Randy. The departure was clean, the relationship intact. Rudy left the following year. As Matt's eldest son from a previous marriage, his presence on the channel carried a different weight than most of the crew. He was a skilled fabricator and trail driver, deeply embedded in the operation. In April of 2022, he stepped back from and began building his own brand, Rudy's Adventure and Design, focused on his own fabrication projects and off-road pursuits. Matt has been publicly supportive from the start. The two have remained close, and Rudy has continued showing up at MRA events including Easter Jeep Safari and King of the Hammers. Tucker departed in early 2023. Matt addressed it in the comments when viewers started asking. Tucker had decided to try freelancing, the team respected the call, and he moved on to work alongside Trevor at a channel called Misadventure Lab. Trevor himself had already transitioned away from regular appearances by that point, his active filming style and memorable on-camera tumbles having made him a fan favorite during the channel's early growth. Tom, Matt's childhood friend, nuclear engineer, and one of the more quietly fascinating people to ever appear in a recovery video, also stepped back from regular involvement to pursue his own projects. Then there was Hefe. He retired from the Army National Guard in mid-2024 and, with Matt's encouragement, left to pursue his own YouTube channel and outdoor adventures. In a detail that says something about how Matt operates, the editing for Hefe's channel is still handled by Matt's team. The core remains Jamie, the sons, Ed, and a crew that keeps the operation running. But the roster that longtime viewers grew attached to looks different now than it did at the peak. That tends to happen when something gets big enough to launch careers. Matt Wetzel didn't set out to build a movement. He set out to stop losing hours on jobs that should have taken minutes. The fact that those two things ended up being connected, that solving a local terrain problem in Washington County, Utah quietly reshaped how an entire community approaches off-road recovery, is either a remarkable coincidence or proof that genuinely good solutions have a way of spreading whether you promote them or not. The lightweight rig and kinetic rope combination that Matt developed out of necessity is now standard thinking across the off-road recovery world. Operators who had never heard of Hurricane Utah were watching his videos, studying his techniques, and changing the way they worked. The Banana wasn't just a funny-looking Jeep that surprised one skeptical motorhome owner. It became a proof of concept that thousands of people took seriously. When Matt partnered with Yankum to develop his signature rope line, the product sold well enough to eclipse his own towing revenue. The tool that saved his business became the business. The off-road games he created in Hurricane grew into a legitimate community event, drawing 28 YouTube creators, more than 50 vendors, and raising money for the Utah Public Lands Alliance and local search and rescue operations. A towing company from a small desert town had built an annual gathering that people planned trips around. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because something real was built underneath the content. The legal chapter left a mark. It would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. The comment sections shifted, the conversations around the channel changed, and some of the trust that had been the brand's foundation took a hit it hasn't fully recovered from in every corner of the fan base. Matt paid his restitution, served his probation, and kept uploading. Whether that's resilience or pragmatism probably depends on who you ask. What's harder to argue with is the scope of what he built. Nearly 2 million subscribers, hundreds of millions of views, a merchandise operation that outgrew the towing company that started it all. A crew of people who went on to build their own audiences using the platform his channel gave them. An approach to off-road recovery that spread far beyond one junkyard in southern Utah. A middle-aged tow truck driver with no media training, no tech background, and no obvious reason to succeed at any of this looked at a broken system and decided to build something better. That decision changed off-road recovery forever, and he filmed the whole thing on an iPhone.